She swallowed. The tiny sip of soup vanished past lips that hadn't willingly accepted nourishment in months, not without a fight, not without tears. Her father, Edward Sterling, watched from across the booth, the powerful millionaire suddenly frozen, breathless. Then the impossible happened. His silent daughter, Sophie, lifted her gaze. She looked not past, but at the young waitress kneeling beside her wheelchair. A flicker of something. Recognition, connection. The carefully controlled world Edward Sterling inhabited tilted on its axis. His voice, when he found it, was a strangled whisper, raw disbelief tearing through his usual composure. How did you do that?" The bell above the diner door chimed a soft, almost apologetic sound, entirely out of place with the man who stepped inside. Edward Sterling carried the unmistakable aura of wealth and power, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the worn linoleum floors and the comforting scent of brewing coffee and frying bacon. But tonight, the formidable CEO wasn't here for business. He wasn't here for the quiet anonymity the small, out-of-the-way diner offered. He was here because he was out of options. Beside him, nestled in her specialized wheelchair, was Sophie, 6 years old, a fragile figure engulfed in a pale blue coat, her dark hair framing a face that remained resolutely turned towards the floor. Her small fingers twitched rhythmically against the fabric of her blanket, a silent, ceaseless motion that tore at Edward's meticulously controlled composure. She made no sound, offered no glance towards the gentle evening bustle. She was simply contained, lost somewhere he couldn't reach. A hostess, young with shadows under her eyes that spoke of long shifts, offered a practiced smile. Table for two. Something quiet. Edward's voice was low resonant, accustomed to commanding boardrooms. Yet here it held a thread of weariness. They were led to a booth tucked away in the back corner. As Edward slid onto the vinyl bench opposite his daughter, he picked up the laminated menu, his gaze barely registering the listed specials. His focus remained locked on the small, silent child before him. "Sophie," he began gently, the practiced softness feeling hollow even to his own ears. "Are you hungry, sweetheart?" Silence. The same heavy silence that had blanketed their lives since the accident, since her mother. He cut the thought off, a familiar ache tightening his chest. He'd built an empire from sheer will, navigated treacherous deals worth hundreds of millions, made impossible decisions under crushing pressure. Yet facing his own daughter across a chipped formica table, he felt utterly, devastatingly powerless. This helplessness was a far heavier burden than any corporate crisis. A waitress approached, notepad poised. She looked to be in her mid-20s, maybe. There was a warmth in her hazel eyes that seemed genuine, a stark contrast to the forced cheerfulness often found in service. A light dusting of flour on the sleeve of her faded blue uniform suggested she might have just come from the kitchen. "Good evening, I'm Clara. What can I get started for you folks tonight?" Her voice was calm, unassuming. Edward cleared his throat, pulling his attention from Sophie with visible effort. "I'll have the grilled chicken. For my daughter." He hesitated, the familiar knot of anxiety tightening. What could Sophie possibly tolerate tonight? Something soft? He finished the request, sounding almost like a complex business negotiation. In its uncertainty, Clara's gaze flickered towards Sophie, not with pity, but with a quiet, assessing look. Her brow furrowed slightly. "How about some chicken noodle soup? It's homemade, very gentle." Edward simply nodded, relieved to have the decision made. "Fine. That's fine. Great. Be right back." As Clara walked away, Edward instinctively reached for his phone, scrolling through emails he didn't truly see. Would Sophie eat? Or would it be another night of quiet refusal? Another meal untouched? Another wave of despair washing over him? Minutes later, Clara returned, placing the steaming bowl of soup carefully in front of Sophie and Edward's plate before him. "There you go, Holla. If you need anything else." She gave a small smile and stepped back, attending to another table. Edward sighed, picking up the small spoon. "All right, Sophie Bug. Let's just try a little bit, okay?" He scooped a tiny amount, mostly broth, and brought it slowly towards her lips. Predictably, before the spoon even neared her mouth, Sophie turned her head away sharply, her small hand coming up in a gesture of dismissal, though not quite knocking the spoon. This time, progress Edward wasn't sure. The soup remained untouched. He tried again. Just one little taste. Nothing. She just sat there, fingers twitching, lost in her impenetrable world. Frustration, hot and sharp, pricked at him, not at her, never at her, but at his own inadequacy. He ran a hand over his face, forcing himself to remain calm, aware of the curious glances from a nearby table. He was so consumed with maintaining his composure that he barely registered Clara stepping quietly beside their booth until she spoke. "Excuse me," she said softly. Edward looked up, surprised. She was kneeling slightly, bringing herself closer to Sophie's eye level, her expression calm and unreadable. "May I?" she asked, nodding towards the spoon still in Edward's hand. He frowned. He wasn't accustomed to interference, especially not regarding Sophie. He employed the best therapists, the most renowned specialists. What could a diner waitress possibly do? He usually rebuffed such offers curtly. But there was something in Clara's steady gaze, a quiet confidence, mixed with genuine empathy that made him pause. It wasn't pity. It felt like understanding. Wordlessly, hesitantly, he relinquished the spoon. Clara shifted slightly, positioning herself directly in front of Sophie, not looming, just present. She didn't immediately try to feed her. Instead, she simply spoke her voice, a low murmur, warm and gentle. "Hi, Sophie," she said, as if greeting an old friend. "My name's Clara. That soup smells pretty good, doesn't it?" Sophie didn't respond, but Clara didn't waver. "She dipped the spoon into the soup, you know." Clara continued conversationally, holding the spoon lightly. "My little brother used to say, soup was like a warm hug for your tummy on a chilly evening." She brought the spoon just a little closer. No pressure, no demand, just a tiny hug. To see if he was right. Edward watched, utterly transfixed. He'd never seen anyone talk to Sophie quite like that. Not like a patient to be managed, but like a person capable of understanding, deserving of conversation, even without a reply. For a long moment, nothing happened. The background clatter of the diner seemed to fade. Then, almost imperceptibly, Sophie's fingers stilled their twitching, her head tilted just a fraction towards the spoon. Edward held his breath, slowly, cautiously. Clara brought the spoonful of warm broth to Sophie's lips. Time stretched, and then she swallowed, a single tiny sip. It felt like the world shifted on its axis. For Edward, whose daughter often refused nourishment entirely unless medically necessary, it was monumental. Everything. But then something even more astonishing occurred. Sophie's eyes, usually vacant or downcast, lifted. She looked at Clara. Not through her, not past her, but directly at her, and across her small, serious face flickered the ghost of something Edward hadn't seen in years, a tiny, hesitant, almost smile. The air left Edward's lungs in a rush. The diner, The other patrons, the low hum of conversation, it all vanished. There was only his daughter, this unexpected flicker of connection, and the young woman kneeling beside her, who had somehow impossibly reached into the fortress of silence and found a glimmer of the child within. His voice, when he finally found it, was rough, barely a whisper. How? How did you do that? Clara looked up at him, then her hazel eyes holding that same calm warmth, but now mixed with something else, something unreadable, perhaps a shadow of her own past. She offered a small, almost uncertain smile. I just talked to her, she said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Sometimes all anyone needs is to feel seen. Edward stared, speechless. He had no answer. He only knew that this waitress Clara had just done something extraordinary, and deep within the guarded fortress of Edward Sterling's own bruised heart, a dangerous, unfamiliar feeling began to stir hope. Hope, once ignited, is a difficult flame to extinguish, especially in a man like Edward Sterling, who hadn't allowed himself to feel its warmth in years. The image of Sophie's fleeting smile, the impossible moment of connection, facilitated by a quiet waitress named Clara Hayes, replayed in his mind relentlessly. It was a fragile flicker against the overwhelming darkness of his daughter's silence. But it was there. And Edward, a man who built empires on calculated risks and decisive action, knew he couldn't let it fade without a fight. Sleep offered little respite that night. Back in the sterile quiet of his penthouse apartment, miles away from the comforting clatter of the diner, Edward did what he did best. He deployed his resources. A few discreet calls to his highly efficient assistant set the wheels in motion. Find out everything about Clara Hayes. The information came back swiftly, painting a picture both intriguing and deeply perplexing. Clara Hayes hadn't always been a waitress, wiping down tables. She had been a star student at NYU, top of her class, specializing in pediatric special education and developmental therapy. Professors' notes described her as brilliant, instinctive, uniquely gifted in connecting with children facing profound challenges. Then, 2 years ago, shortly before completing her advanced degree, she had vanished from academic records. No diploma, no explanation. Just gone. Until she'd surfaced here, working double shifts at a neighborhood diner, miles away from the career she was clearly destined for. Why, the question echoed in the silence of Edward's study. What could make someone with that level of talent walk away? He found her back at the diner the following evening, during a lull between the dinner rush and the late-night coffee crowd. She was wiping down the counter, her movements efficient, practiced. The same dusting of flour was on her sleeve. She looked up as he approached, a flicker of surprise, quickly masked, crossing her features. Mr. Sterling, she acknowledged, her tone carefully neutral, her hand pausing mid-wipe. Edward didn't waste time on pleasantries. Miss Hayes, Clara. We need to talk. She straightened, placing the damp cloth on the counter. She glanced around the mostly empty diner. I'm working. Mr. Sterling. This is important. It's about Sophie. The mention of his daughter's name made her hesitate. She sighed softly, then nodded towards a quiet booth in the corner, the same one he and Sophie had occupied the night before. Okay, what is it? He slid into the booth, the vinyl cool beneath his hand. Clara remained standing, her arms crossed loosely, a subtle barrier I had my assistant look into. Potential caregivers. Edward began choosing his words carefully, omitting the direct investigation into her past. For now, someone with experience, with children like Sophie. He paused, meeting her steady hazel gaze. Your name didn't come up through official channels. which is surprising given your background at NYU. Clara visibly stiffened. Her knuckles whitened where her arms were crossed. I don't know what you're talking about. Top of your class. Edward continued his voice, calm but firm. Specializing in pediatric therapy. Glowing recommendations. Then, nothing. 2 years ago, you walked away. He watched her closely, saw the almost imperceptible flinch. Why, Clara? Her lips pressed into a thin line. That's really none of your business. It becomes my business. Edward leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. When you're the only person who has managed to elicit a genuine response from my daughter in over 2 years. That single sip of soup that look she gave you. That was more progress than months of expensive therapy has achieved. His own voice held a raw edge he rarely exposed. I saw it. Clara looked away, focusing on a sugar dispenser on the table. The air crackled with unspoken tension. Come work for me. Edward said the words stark in the quiet diner. Be Sophie's caregiver. Full time, name your price. He tried to inject his usual business negotiation tone, but it felt inadequate. We offer a competitive compensation package benefits. And, he faltered, realizing how absurd it sounded. Access to a rather extensive collection of stuffed animals. A small, humorless sound escaped Clara's lips. It wasn't quite a laugh. She finally looked back at him, her eyes holding a profound sadness that startled him. Mr. Sterling. Edward. You don't understand. I appreciate the offer more than you know. But I can't. Why not? You have the skills, the gift. No, she interrupted sharper this time. I don't do that anymore. I'm not qualified. That's not what NYU thought. Things change, she whispered the words, heavy with unspoken history. I'm not the person you think I am. I can't be responsible for. She stopped herself, shaking her head slightly. I just can't. The finality in her voice was like a physical blow. He saw the genuine fear lurking beneath the surface, the shadow of a deep, unhealed wound. He thought of Mrs. Albright, his late wife's cousin, who managed his household staff with an iron fist and a healthy dose of skepticism towards anything unconventional. Albright would have a fit if she knew he was trying to hire a waitress based on one interaction. She already thought his choice of therapists was too progressive, constantly advocating for stricter, more traditional approaches, bringing Clara into that environment. Yet the image of Sophie's face looking at Clara burned brighter than any potential household friction. What if it wasn't permanent? Edward countered, ignoring the rational part of his brain screaming at him to accept her refusal. He was operating on instinct now, on that single flicker of hope. Just a trial period. 1 week, 7 days. See if you can help her. If it doesn't work, or if you still feel you can't do it, you walk away, no questions asked. Generous compensation for your time, of course. Clara stared at him, her expression torn. He saw the internal battle raging in her eyes, the instinct to flee versus the undeniable pull she felt towards the silent little girl who had responded to her touch. He saw the memories flicker, painful ones. He guessed that made her want to run a mile from his offer. But he also saw the innate compassion that had made her kneel by Sophie's side in the first place. Her throat worked. She took a deep, shaky breath, her gaze dropping back to the sugar dispenser, as if seeking an answer. There. The silence stretched, filled only by the low hum of the diner's refrigerator. Finally she looked up, her eyes meeting his, filled with a mixture of resignation and profound reluctance. 1 week, she said, Her voice, barely audible, strained. 7 days. That's all, then I'm gone. She swallowed hard, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. And Mr. Sterling, don't expect miracles. I meant what I said. I'm not the person you think I am. It wasn't the enthusiastic acceptance he might have hoped for, but it wasn't a no. It was a door cracked open, however reluctantly. 1 week, Edward agreed, a surge of adrenaline, mixing with the underlying hope. Thank you, Clara. She just gave a curt nod, turning away quickly to grab her cleaning cloth, already retreating behind her professional facade. But Edward had seen the flicker of conflict, the depth of her hesitation. Whatever ghosts haunted Clara Hayes, they were powerful. And for 1 week he was gambling his daughter's fragile hope on the chance that Clara's compassion might be even stronger. Stepping into the Sterling residence felt less like entering a home, and more like being admitted to a private, excessively quiet museum. Marble floors gleamed under recessed lighting, echoing Clara's hesitant footsteps. Vast minimalist spaces flowed into one another, decorated with imposing modern art and furniture that looked beautiful but profoundly uncomfortable. It was a world away from the cheerful chaos of the diner, a world away from anything Clara had ever known. It felt cold, vast, and terribly empty, despite the army of silent staff who occasionally materialized in the periphery. Her assigned room was larger than her entire apartment, complete with an ensuite bathroom that rivaled a spa. It was luxurious, impersonal, and did little to ease the knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. This 1 week trial felt like a countdown to inevitable failure. The first 2 days were a delicate, challenging dance. Sophie remained largely withdrawn, a small silent satellite orbiting a world of her own. She tolerated Clara's presence, but offered little engagement, often turning away when Clara spoke or tried to guide her hand towards a toy. Doubt, cold and familiar, began to creep in. What if I've lost it? What if I can't reach her? What if I make things worse like I did with Leo? Clara pushed the thoughts away, focusing fiercely on the little girl before her. She remembered her training, the core principle that had always guided her. See the child, not the diagnosis. She spoke to Sophie, constantly narrating her actions, reading simple stories aloud in a calm, steady voice, even when Sophie seemed utterly oblivious. She introduced sensory activities, textured fabrics, gentle music, carefully chosen scents, watching intently for the smallest flicker of response. Her efforts were often overseen by the imposing figure of Mrs. Albright Edwards, cousin by marriage, and the undisputed commander of the household, a woman with silver hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. Mrs. Albright maintained an air of polite yet palpable skepticism. Miss Hayes, she'd said on the first morning, her voice smooth but cool. Mr. Sterling has informed me of this temporary arrangement. While I trust his judgment implicitly, you understand that Sophie's care has previously been managed by certified specialists. We have rigorous protocols. The unspoken message was clear. You are an outsider, a waitress, and you are being watched. Clara offered a polite nod, refusing to be intimidated. Though Mrs. Albright's subtle criticisms, perhaps a more structured approach. Miss Hayes or Dr. Evans never allowed glitter indoors. It's highly impractical, were relayed back to Edward. Clara was sure, amidst the sterile grandeur, Clara found herself observing Edward too. He was present more than she expected, often appearing silently during her sessions with Sophie, his expression unreadable. Sometimes he'd try to help his large hands, surprisingly clumsy, when attempting to assemble a child's puzzle or operate a complex, therapeutic swing. One afternoon, struggling with a particularly intricate piece of equipment, designed to encourage motor skills. Edward let out a frustrated sigh. This thing has more buttons than my jet. Clara couldn't help a small smile. Maybe try reading the manual first, Mr. Sterling. He shot her a wry glance. Where's the challenge in that? The brief moment of shared, almost normal exasperation felt strangely grounding in the otherwise rarefied air. But the underlying tension remained. The house, despite its size, felt claustrophobic, amplifying the memories Clara fought so hard to suppress. The scent of antiseptic cleaner in Sophie's therapy room reminded her of hospital corridors. A particular shade of blue in a painting evoked the blanket Leo had cherished. At night alone in her opulent room, the silence pressed in, filled only by the ghosts of the past. Then on the fourth day, the carefully constructed dam holding back Clara's fear began to crack. Sophie seemed listless, slightly warm to the touch. It was likely nothing a minor fluctuation, but for Clara, the world tilted. A sudden icy wave of panic washed over her fever. It started with a fever. The memory of Leo's final illness slammed into her with physical force. Her breath hitched. Her hand started to tremble. She reached for the thermometer, her movements jerky. Just check the temperature, she told herself. Stay calm. But her heart was pounding, echoing the frantic rhythm of that terrible night 2 years ago. She was fumbling with the device when Edward walked in, having just returned from a meeting. He took one look at her pale face, her trembling hands, Sophie looking slightly flushed in her chair, and his own expression tightened with concern. Clara, what's wrong? She feels warm. Clara stammered, her voice thin, unfamiliar. I think she might have a fever. We need to. The protocol was clear. Monitor informed the doctor if it spiked. But all Clara could see was Leo slipping away, while she stood by, helpless. The room started to swim. She swayed, gripping the back of Sophie's wheelchair for support. Edward was beside her in an instant, his hand steadying her elbow. Okay, let's check, he said. Calmly, though, his eyes searched her face with sharp concern. He took the thermometer, his movements surprisingly gentle, and checked Sophie's temperature. Slightly elevated, but barely. He reported, his gaze still fixed on Clara. Nothing alarming yet. We'll keep an eye on it. Clara, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. The word hung in the air. Ghost, Leo. She couldn't breathe. She pulled away from Edward's touch, mumbling something incoherent about needing air, and practically fled the room, escaping into the impersonal hallway, leaning against the cool wall, fighting for control. Her reaction was disproportionate, terrifyingly so. It wasn't just concern for Sophie. It was sheer, unadulterated panic rooted in her own past failure. Edward watched her go, a deep frown etched between his brows. He checked on Sophie again, reassuring himself she was stable, before turning his attention back to Clara's extreme reaction. It wasn't just caregiver stress. It was something deeper, something broken. He recalled the investigation, the brilliance, the sudden dropout. Now witnessing her raw panic over a minor temperature spike. The pieces began to click into place. He made another call, this one more specific, directing his assistant to cross-reference hospital admissions and obituaries from 2 years ago with the name Hayes. The confirmation arrived less than an hour later. Caleb Leo Hayes passed away suddenly, cerebral palsy. The dates aligned perfectly with Clara's disappearance from NYU. Later that evening, after Sophie's temperature had returned to normal, and she was settled for the night, Edward found Clara sitting alone in the dimly lit conservatory, staring out at the manicured gardens shrouded in darkness. She looked small, fragile, her earlier composure shattered. He approached quietly, pulling up a wicker chair opposite her. She didn't look up immediately. "Clara," he began softly, his voice devoid of judgment, only a quiet gravity. She flinched slightly at his tone. "I know why you left NYU." Her head snapped up, her eyes wide, with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I told you. I know about Leo," he said gently, cutting her off before she could erect her defenses. "I know he was your brother. And I know what happened." The blood drained from her face. A choked sob escaped her lips, raw and painful. The careful facade she maintained crumbled completely, revealing the devastating grief beneath. "You don't understand," she whispered, tears finally spilling over tracking pathways down her pale cheeks. "He was everything. My parents. They weren't really around. It was just me and him. I learned everything for him. All the therapy, the studies. It was all to help him to make his life better." Her voice broke. "I promised him I'd always be there. I promised I'd fix it." She took a ragged breath, hugging herself tightly, as if trying to hold herself together. That night, he got sick. "Just a fever," I thought. Her words dissolved into anguished sobs. "It got worse so fast. By the time we got him to the hospital." She couldn't finish, shaking her head, consumed by guilt. "I was studying to save kids like him," she finally managed, looking up at Edward, her eyes swimming with unshed agony and self-loathing. "I was supposed to know. I should have seen it sooner. But I didn't. I failed him. Edward. I failed my brother." She buried her face in her hands. How can I possibly be trusted with anyone else, especially someone as fragile as Sophie? I can't go through that again. Edward sat in silence, the weight of her confession settling heavily in the quiet room. He finally understood the depth of her fear, the source of her insistence that she wasn't qualified. It wasn't about lack of skill. It was about the crushing weight of perceived failure and the terrifying fear of history repeating itself. He saw past the waitress, past the NYU dropout, and saw a young woman shattered by loss, desperately trying to protect herself and others from more pain. His initial hope was now tempered with a profound, aching empathy. Clara's raw confession hung in the air between them, long after the tears subsided, creating not distance, but a fragile, unexpected bridge. The sterile conservatory moments before a place of solitary grief for Clara now held a shared, unspoken understanding. Edward no longer saw just a waitress or a former student. He saw the weight of the cross she bore, the crushing guilt that had driven her into hiding. And Clara, having laid bare her deepest wound, felt not judgment from this powerful, reserved man, but a quiet, startling empathy. The dynamic shifted. The one-week trial became an unspoken continuation. Clara, though still carrying the ever-present ache of Leo's memory, now channeled her energy with renewed, almost fierce determination into helping Sophie. It was as if, by nurturing this fragile child, she could somehow offer restitution to the brother she couldn't save. Progress, once incremental, began to blossom. Clara's approach was a blend of patience, intuition, and techniques honed during her studies, but applied with genuine warmth. She filled Sophie's days not just with structured therapy tasks, but with music art, messy play, and constant gentle conversation. She learned Sophie's subtle cues, the slight widening of her eyes that meant interest, the specific finger twitch that signaled frustration, the almost imperceptible softening around her mouth when Clara hummed a particular tune. And slowly, miraculously, Sophie began to respond. She started making consistent eye contact. She began using simple picture cards to indicate choices. One afternoon, during messy play with finger paints, she emitted a soft, tentative sound. Not quite a word, but a clear vocalization directed at Clara, full of nascent curiosity. Edward witnessed these transformations with a sense of awe that bordered on reverence. The hope ignited in the diner now burned steadier, brighter. And it changed him. He found himself rearranging his schedule, pushing multi-million-dollar negotiations back, an hour delegating tasks he once would have micromanaged. He started joining Clara and Sophie, not just as an observer, but as an active participant. He learned to be patient during feeding times, mimicking Clara's calm persistence. He fumbled through learning the picture communication system, occasionally mixing up juice with book. Much to Clara's quiet amusement, one evening, attempting to help Clara prepare Sophie's specialized dinner, a task usually handled by the kitchen staff, he managed to create an alarming amount of smoke while trying to simply steam vegetables. Clara entered the kitchen, waving a hand in front of her face. "Mr. Sterling, I appreciate the effort, truly, but the smoke alarm is notoriously sensitive." Edward coughed, looking slightly sheepish amidst the haze. "It adds rustic charm," he offered weakly. Clara just smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached her eyes. "Right, rustic charm. Maybe let's stick to you reading the stories, and me handling the potential fire hazards." "Deal," he agreed readily, a corresponding smile touching his own lips. These moments of light-heartedness, of shared normalcy, felt like discovering hidden springs in a desert. He found himself talking more freely with Clara during Sophie's naps or after she was asleep. Not just about Sophie, but occasionally about the pressures of his work, the lingering loneliness after his wife's passing, things he rarely voiced. And Clara, in turn, slowly began to share small positive memories of Leo, his infectious laugh, his love for superheroes, tentative steps towards healing, towards allowing joy back into the narrative of her past. His newfound engagement also brought him into direct, though polite, conflict with Mrs. Albright. The older woman's disapproval of Clara hadn't lessened, merely become more veiled. She'd make pointed remarks about routine disruption or unproven methods. Within Edward's earshot one afternoon, Mrs. Albright intercepted Edward in the hallway after observing a music therapy session Clara had improvised. "Edward," she began, her voice smooth as silk, "while Miss Hayes is certainly enthusiastic, are you sure deviating so far from Dr. Evans' established protocols is wise? Stability is paramount for Sophie." Edward stopped turning to face her fully, his expression calm but unyielding. "Mrs. Albright, Clara has achieved more connection and progress with Sophie in a few weeks than Dr. Evans did in 6 months. Her enthusiasm, as you call it, is precisely what Sophie needs. She stays, and she has my full support." Mrs. Albright's lips thinned, but she merely inclined her head. "As you wish, Edward." The battle line, however, had been clearly drawn. The growing closeness between Edward and Clara was palpable, an undercurrent beneath the daily routines. A shared glance over Sophie's head as she accomplished a small task. Fingers brushing accidentally as they both reached for the same toy, late-evening conversations that lingered longer than necessary. It was a fragile thing, unnamed and untested, but undeniably present. Then came the afternoon that felt like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. They were in the therapy room. Clara had been patiently working with Sophie on verbal sounds, using puppets and songs. Edward sat nearby, watching his heart aching with a familiar mixture of hope and fear. Clara held up a small, fluffy duck puppet. "Duck," she said, clearly making a quacking sound. "Can you say, 'Duck, Sophie bug, quack, quack'?" Sophie watched her dark eyes fixed on the puppet. Her lips moved silently. Clara waited, patient, expectant. And then it happened. A small, slightly slurred but distinct sound emerged. "Da," Sophie said, looking not at the duck but directly at Edward. "Da-da." The world stopped. Edward froze his breath, caught somewhere in his throat. Had he heard right? He looked at Clara, whose eyes were wide, shining with unshed tears. She nodded a slow, confirming motion, her own breath hitching. "Da-da," Sophie repeated a little louder this time, a radiant, genuine smile spreading across her face as she saw her father's stunned expression. Joy pure and overwhelming flooded Edward. He rushed forward, kneeling beside Sophie's chair, tears blurring his own vision. "Yes, sweetheart, yes, Dada, you said it." He gently cupped her face. Overcome, he looked up at Clara, his voice thick with emotion. "Clara, she did it," Clara whispered, laughing through her tears, her face luminous with shared triumph. It was a perfect moment, a culmination of weeks of patient effort, a testament to the connection they had built. The three of them were bound together in that instant by a joy so profound it felt sacred. The door to the therapy room opened abruptly. Mrs. Albright stood there, her expression uncharacteristically stiff, holding a tablet. The joyful atmosphere evaporated instantly. "Edward," she said, her voice clipped, ignoring Clara completely. "I apologize for the interruption, but there's an urgent security matter regarding the network access logs you asked me to review." She stepped further into the room, her gaze sweeping over the scene. Edward, kneeling, teary-eyed Clara beside him, flushed with happiness. Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, and perhaps she added her tone, dropping laced with insinuation, as she finally acknowledged Clara. "We should discuss appropriate professional boundaries at a more convenient time." The accusation implied, but unmistakable, landed like ice in the warmth of their shared victory, leaving Edward and Clara stunned, and the joyful echo of Sophie's first word hanging suddenly fragile in the tense silence. Mrs. Albright's interruption cast a chill over the warmth of Sophie's breakthrough. Though Edward quickly dismissed her security concerns and smoothly redirected the conversation back to celebrating Sophie's achievement, the insinuation lingered, an unspoken accusation, poisoning the air. An awkwardness settled between Edward and Clara. In the following days, a heightened awareness of the invisible lines Mrs. Albright had tried to draw. Yet paradoxically, the external pressure seemed only to deepen the connection, pulling them together. They found themselves seeking each other out in quiet moments, sharing a cup of coffee after Sophie was asleep, discussing therapy strategies with an intensity that bled into more personal territory, or simply sitting in comfortable silence. While Sophie napped nearby, Edward spoke, haltingly, about his late wife. Not just her death, but her vibrant life, sharing memories he hadn't voiced to anyone. Clara, in turn, offered glimpses into her bond with Leo, focusing now not just on the tragic end, but on his resilience, his humor, the joy he brought. Despite his challenges, vulnerability once revealed created an intimacy stronger than any physical boundary. One rainy afternoon, while Sophie was unusually captivated by a colorful animated movie, Edward and Clara found themselves standing near the tall windows of the living room, watching the downpour lash against the glass. Sometimes Edward murmured, his gaze distant. "This house feels too big, too quiet." Clara nodded, understanding the sentiment more than he knew. "It's beautiful, but..." "Yeah." A little silence goes a long way. He turned to her, then his blue eyes searching her face. "You've brought noise back, Clara." Laughter. hope. It hasn't felt like this here in a long time. The intensity in his gaze made her heart beat faster. She could feel the pull, the dangerous warmth spreading through her. This was exactly what she feared. The closeness, the dependency, the terrifying possibility of caring too much. Leo, a voice whispered inside her. Remember Leo. Remember how love and hope turned to ash. Before she could retreat, before the familiar panic could clamp down, Edward reached out his fingers, gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was electric, simple, yet profound. Time seemed to slow the patter of the rain, fading into a dull roar. Clara, he breathed his name, a question, a plea. She looked up at him, her breath catching. She saw the loneliness in his eyes, the hesitant hope, the reflection of her own fragile longing. And in that moment, the fear was momentarily overshadowed by a powerful, undeniable connection. He leaned in, slowly, carefully, giving her every chance to pull away. His lips met hers, tentative at first, then deepening with a gentle warmth that spoke more of shared comfort and burgeoning affection than raw passion. It was a kiss that felt like finding shelter from the storm, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between them against all odds. For one dizzying, stolen moment, Clara let herself feel it, let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, happiness wasn't entirely out of reach. And then reality crashed back in with the force of a physical blow. Leo's face. The hospital room. The suffocating guilt. It wasn't fair. It wasn't safe. Love meant loss. Connection meant pain. She couldn't do this. She couldn't risk. Sophie couldn't risk. Edward couldn't risk shattering herself all over again. She jerked back as if burned her breath, coming in unsteady gasps, her eyes wide with sudden panic. Edward's brow furrowed, confusion and hurt flickering in his expression. Clara, I can't, she whispered, shaking her head, taking a step back. The warmth of the kiss turned to ice in her veins. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. This is wrong. He reached for her again, concern etched on his face. Wrong. What are you talking about? But Clara was already retreating physically and emotionally. The walls she had painstakingly built around her heart slammed back into place, higher and thicker than before. The risk felt too immense, the potential cost catastrophic. Unbeknownst to them, Mrs. Albright had observed the exchange from the doorway, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes sharp. Later that day, finding Clara alone, organizing Sophie's therapy supplies, the older woman approached with feigned sympathy. My dear Mrs. Albright began softly. I couldn't help but notice. Things seem rather intense between you and Mr. Sterling. She paused, letting the implication hang. Edward is a good man, but he's vulnerable, grieving. Sometimes in that state, people mistake gratitude or loneliness for something more. She patted Clara's arm condescendingly. It wouldn't do for Sophie to become attached, only for things to change when he inevitably moves on, would it? A clean break is often kindest in the long run. The words, coated in false concern, struck Clara's rawest nerve. Was that all this was gratitude? Pity? Was she just a temporary fix for his loneliness, destined to be replaced? The seed of doubt, planted by Albright and watered by her own deep-seated fear and insecurity, took root. She thought of Leo. She thought of failing him. Failing Sophie. Failing Edward by letting him get close to someone so broken, Albright's words twisted as they were felt like a terrible kind of truth. She had to leave, now before the damage was irreparable. Steeling herself, wiping away any trace of emotion, Clara walked purposefully to Edward's home office. Later that evening, he looked up from his desk, surprise registering on his face. "Clara, is everything okay?" She stood rigidly before him, her hands clenched at her sides. "I'm quitting Mr. Sterling." The words felt like shards of glass in her throat. His expression darkened instantly. He leaned back, slowly folding his arms, his eyes narrowing. "Come again, I can't do this anymore." She forced the words out, keeping her voice steady, devoid of the turmoil raging inside. "My week was up a long time ago. This was always temporary. Temporary." He stood, then disbelief warring with anger in his gaze. "After everything, after the progress Sophie has made, after—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication of the kiss hung heavily between them. "Sophie will be fine," Clara said the lie, tasting bitter. She couldn't let herself think about Sophie's trusting eyes, her new words, the bond they shared. If she did, she'd break. "She won't be fine." Edward's voice was low, tight with fury and hurt. "You know she won't. What is this really about? Clara." "That kiss." She flinched but held his gaze, forcing herself to deliver the blow that would ensure he let her go. The cruelest defense mechanism she could muster. The kiss was a mistake. "You're vulnerable, grieving. You think you need someone. But I was never meant to be a permanent solution." She took a shaky breath, steeling herself for the final, unforgivable words. "You're just looking for someone to replace your wife, and I won't be her." The silence that followed was absolute chilling. Edward's face went pale, then hardened into a mask of cold fury. The hurt in his eyes was quickly eclipsed by a deep, cutting anger. His hands gripped the edge of his desk knuckles, white. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. "Glacial, get out." Clara's throat burned Edward. "Get out." Each word was clipped final. There was nothing left to say. She turned, forcing herself to walk away, each step echoing the shattering of something fragile and precious. She didn't look back, leaving Edward standing rigid in the heavy silence, the gulf between them, now an unbridgeable chasm. The silence that descended upon the Sterling residence after Clara's departure was heavier, more profound than before. It wasn't just the absence of her gentle voice or quiet presence. It was the extinguishing of the fragile light she had brought into Sophie's world. Within 3 days, the progress Sophie had made vanished, as if it had never been. The tentative words dissolved back into silence. The nascent engagement faded into vacant stares. She refused food, turned away from therapies, and retreated so far into herself that even Edward's desperate attempts couldn't reach her. The flicker of connection Clara had nurtured was gone, leaving only the familiar, aching void. Edward's initial cold fury slowly morphed into a gnawing despair, laced with a guilt so potent it felt corrosive. He saw his daughter slipping away, saw the reflection of his own failure in her empty eyes, Clara's parting words cruel as they were echoed in his mind. But now they sounded less like an accusation and more like a desperate defense from someone deeply wounded, someone he had wounded further. His gaze fell upon Mrs. Albright, who moved through the house with an air of quiet efficiency, occasionally offering sympathetic but ultimately unhelpful suggestions for Sophie's care. He remembered her insinuations, her skepticism towards Clara. He saw now how Clara's vulnerability, her past trauma, had been subtly exploited. Whether Albright's motives stemmed from genuine misguided concern or something less charitable, it no longer mattered. She had contributed to this disaster. He summoned her to his study, his voice dangerously calm. "Mrs. Albright." He began cutting through her pleasantries. "Your services are no longer required here. Please arrange to have your belongings packed by the end of the day." The older woman looked momentarily stunned, then drew herself up indignantly. Edward. After all these years, what possible reason? The reason Edward interrupted his voice, like ice, is that I am finally taking full responsibility for this household and for my daughter's well-being. Your judgment regarding Miss Hayes was unwelcome and ultimately detrimental. Your presence is no longer conducive to the environment I intend to create here. He saw a flicker of understanding, or perhaps guilt, in her eyes before she masked it. There was no further argument. She simply gave a stiff nod and left the room. Dismissing her wasn't a solution, but it was a necessary first step, an assertion of his own authority, his own path forward. Alone, Edward sank into his chair, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. He had been so focused on fixing Sophie, on finding a solution, that he hadn't truly seen the people involved. He hadn't fully grasped the depth of Clara's fear, born from unimaginable loss. He hadn't acknowledged his own fear. Fear of letting someone else in, fear of failing again. Fear that Clara's accusation about replacing his wife held a kernel of truth he hadn't wanted to examine. He did need Clara, not just as a caregiver who possessed a unique gift with Sophie, but as Clara, the woman whose quiet strength, surprising humor, and gentle compassion had chipped away at his own defenses, who had made his cavernous house feel however briefly like a home. He needed her warmth, her understanding, and he owed her an apology, one that couldn't be delivered by an assistant. He knew where to find her. The diner felt different this time. He wasn't a desperate father seeking a miracle worker. He was a man seeking forgiveness, hoping for a second chance he wasn't sure he deserved. He found Clara wiping down tables near the end of her shift, looking tired shadows beneath her eyes, more pronounced than before. She froze when she saw him, her hand tightening on the cloth. "Clara," he said, stopping a few feet away, keeping his voice low, humble. "Can we please talk? Properly this time." She hesitated, her gaze wary. "I said everything I needed to say. Mr. Sterling, no." He shook his head. "No, you didn't. And I certainly didn't listen. Please." She looked around the near-empty diner, then sighed, gesturing towards the familiar corner booth. He slid in, but this time she sat opposite him, her posture still guarded, but attentive. "I was wrong." Edward began the words, feeling inadequate but necessary. "Deeply wrong. About everything. I didn't understand. The depth of your fear. The pain you carry about Leo. I didn't see how my own issues, my own grief might have contributed." He met her eyes, holding nothing back. "Those last words you said, they hurt, yes. But I understand now they came from that fear, from wanting to push me away before you could be hurt again. And perhaps you saw something in me, some hesitation that fueled it." He took a breath. "I fired Albright. She won't be a problem again." Clara blinked, absorbing this. "Sophie." Edward's voice cracked slightly. "Sophie isn't doing well. Clara. She's retreated completely. She needs you. Not just your skills. She needs you and—" He paused the next words, costing him more than any business deal. "And I need you. Not as a replacement for anyone. Just as Clara. I was scared too. Scared of letting you in. Scared of what it meant. But living without you, without the hope you brought, it's not living." He leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. "I am so incredibly sorry for how I reacted, for not understanding sooner. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking, can we try again? Can you forgive me? Can we figure this out together?" Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but this time they weren't tears of panic or grief. She searched his face, seeing the raw sincerity, the vulnerability he so rarely showed. She thought of Sophie's smile, her tentative dada. She thought of the unexpected connection she'd felt with this complicated, grieving man. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was met now by a flicker of something stronger, the possibility of trust, of healing. "It won't be easy, Edward," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "My fear, it doesn't just disappear. And you need to be sure. I've never been more sure of anything," he replied instantly, his gaze unwavering. "We'll take it slow, one day at a time, together." And so began the careful, patient work of rebuilding. Clara returned to the Sterling residence, not just as an employee, but as something more, something undefined, but essential. There were awkward moments, hesitant conversations, where they navigated the minefield of past hurts and future anxieties. They talked honestly about Leo, about Edward's late wife, about their fears. They set boundaries and learned to communicate. Clara started working with Sophie again, and slowly, painstakingly, the light began to return to the little girl's eyes. Weeks turned into months. Sophie blossomed under their combined care, her vocabulary expanding, her laughter echoing more frequently through the once silent halls. She started taking tentative steps with a walker, her determination fierce. Edward learned to delegate ruthlessly at work, prioritizing bath times and bedtime stories over late-night conference calls. They found moments of gentle humor in their new normal. Sophie once solemnly informed Edward he was less grumpy. Now Clara's back, causing both adults to burst into surprised laughter. They learned to function not as employer and employee, or even just as co-parents, but as partners facing challenges together, celebrating small victories as a unit. One crisp autumn afternoon, about 6 months after Clara's return, they were sitting on a bench in the garden, watching Sophie determinedly chase fallen leaves, her movements steadier now. The earned peace felt real, tangible. Edward turned to Clara, taking her hand, his touch warm and sure. "Clara Hayes," he began, his voice filled with quiet emotion. "You came into our lives like an unexpected sunrise after a long night. You healed hurts I didn't know how to name. You showed me how to be a father again, how to hope again, how to love again." He met her gaze, his blue eyes clear and certain. "I know the scars are still there for both of us, but I want to spend the rest of my life making new memories, happy ones with you and Sophie." He squeezed her hand gently. "Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Clara's face, but this time they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy, washing away the last vestiges of fear. She saw their journey, the pain and the progress, the love that had grown resiliently through it all. She nodded, unable to speak, a watery laugh escaping her lips. "Yes," she finally whispered. "Yes, Edward. 1,000 times. Yes." He slid a simple, elegant ring onto her finger, then pulled her close. Sophie, sensing the emotion, toddled over, wrapping her small arms around both their legs, beaming up at them. In that moment, bathed in the golden afternoon light, they weren't 3 broken souls anymore. They were simply a family, imperfect, scarred but whole, bound together by love, resilience, and the quiet miracle of second chances. They had found their way home together. And just like that, 3 lives, once fractured by loss and fear, found their way, not just back to each other, but forward into a shared future. Their journey leaves us thinking. Isn't it remarkable how sometimes the deepest connections bloom in the most unexpected places, often when we least expect them? Maybe even when we feel least deserving. How much courage does it take to open a door you thought was locked forever by grief? Watching Edward, Clara, and little Sophie build their family reminds us that healing isn't about erasing the scars. It's about finding the strength together to step into the light again, like finding a sunrise after the longest night. Maybe those moments of vulnerability, of daring to trust again, are where true strength really lies. If this story resonated with you, if it touched that place in your heart that understands loss, hope, and the quiet power of connection, we'd love to hear from you. What part of Clara's struggle with fear or Edward's journey towards vulnerability touched you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's create a conversation. Your feedback is also incredibly valuable as we strive to bring you more meaningful stories. If you have any suggestions on how we can improve aspects of the storytelling you particularly enjoyed, or ideas for future narratives, please let us know in the comments. We read everyone, and your insights help us grow. If Edward, Clara, and Sophie's story warmed your heart, please give this video a like and share it with someone who might find comfort or inspiration in their journey. And of course, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter in our exploration of the human heart and its incredible resilience. Thank you for sharing this time with us. Until next time, take care and keep believing in the power of hope and second chances.